What rules does a participatory economy use for international relations? Find out in this episode of PEP Talk.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Hello and welcome to PEP Talk, the podcast where we discuss the democratic alternative to capitalism known as a participatory economy. I'm your host, Mitchell Szczepanczyk, coming to you from Chicago. In this episode, we will discuss a broad topic, international trade and financial investment, particularly related to the context of a participatory economy. In this episode, I'm joined by two guests. From Portland, Oregon in the United States, I'm joined by Robin Hahnel. He is the co-inventor of the model of a participatory economy. And also joining us from Helsinki, Finland is Antti Jauhiainen. He is a longtime advocate of a participatory economy, writer and contributor to activist efforts for many years. This is admittedly a very broad topic, international trade and financial investment in the context of a participatory economy. Rather than trying to steer it in any preconceived direction, I'd like to ask each of you, Robin and Antti, what comes to mind? What do you think about? What does that mean? So, Robin, could you go first, please?
Yeah, one thing that really wouldn't occur to people living in the beginning of the 21st century is that early socialist thinking on this subject was very, very different from, I think, how all of us now have to think about it in the 21st century. Just as early socialists assumed that after capitalism was overthrown, that the associated workers would figure out how to plan and organize and run their economy once they had the right to do so. Early socialists did not think about socialism as being in the context of national economies. Political parties, socialist political parties were actually simply branches of the Socialist International. So the idea was, well, socialism, when it finally comes, is going to spread all across the world, and even a socialist party in Germany is not a German socialist party; it's just the German branch of the International Socialist Organization. We had the first international that all of them were members of, and then there was a split between the more anarchist and the more Marxist. So we get a second international, and then finally, in the context of the Russian Revolution, we got a third international. But during that entire time period, socialists really didn't, even the political parties were not considered political parties of a particular country, just branches of the Socialist International. And in the early years of the Russian Revolution, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were thinking that there was going to be revolution in Europe in the aftermath of World War I, and that there was therefore going to be an international sort of socialism. Now, what we now know is things didn't work out that way. One of the things we discover is the way people think history is going to evolve isn't always the way it actually evolves. So now we have, a long history of living not only with, national states, but we had experiences where there were countries that were thinking themselves as socialist countries that had to exist in an international atmosphere where most countries were still capitalist. And the other thing that we now are very aware of is that some countries are far more developed and other countries are far less developed. So when we now think about, well, how is socialism going to come to be? I think the most realistic scenario that I can envision for the future is there will be countries where movements that want to establish some sort of socialist government, and we think, more or less like a participatory economy, they will come to power in countries. The country might be a less developed country. It might be a more developed country. It might be a large country. It might be a large country. It might be a small country. But what it means is every one of them will inevitably have to face up to making decisions about how do we carry out trade and what do we do about international investment of different kinds. What is the attitude? And so that's the context in which we're trying to address, how would a country that decides it is going to have some sort of a socialist economy, like a participatory economy, how's it going to approach issues of international trade, international investment, and direct foreign investment? So those are the questions we've tried to address.
Antti, your thoughts regarding international trade, financial investment, and related stuff?
Related stuff. The main related stuff for me is, I think, the climate change and ecological collapse. And I think when talking about global trade or financial investments, what it most brings to my mind is that we need a way to do all sorts of allocation throughout the world to ensure that resources are used much more responsibly than they have been in the past and much more effectively in practice, which means that we don't destroy nature as much as we have. Another thing is that Robin talked about developed and less developed countries. And I have to be a bit of a critiquer here, because when you look at many third world countries, so-called non-developed countries, which actually have managed to protect a lot of their nature and environment, haven't been as effective as us developed countries in using resources. For example, I read just recently that an average American's fridge uses, just a fridge, uses more electricity, I think it was in a week, than an average person living in a third world country throughout the whole year. So just the fridge alone uses more electricity. And of course, in my view, this all points out the huge inefficiencies of our current global trade, of our current economic system. And when we're discussing this whole issue from the viewpoint of a democratic economy, I think this is one of the main points, that it's exactly these kind of imbalances that sort of require us to build a new network of international trade based on much more, I'd say, much more effective, but also just simply much more it's not responsive. My English is failing me, but sort of responsible use of resources than we currently have. And I think that's the kind of framework the democratic economy is able to provide us.
Well, I agree with Antti that when we're thinking about socialism in the 21st century, we have to think about it as arising in countries where most of the other countries, at least initially, are going to still be capitalist economies. And there will be large variations in levels of economic development. And the other context in which we have to realize we're working is a context in which the battle to prevent cataclysmic climate change is absolutely foremost. And only if that battle is successfully waged is there going to be a world that's, even worth thinking about. And the only way that we are going to successfully respond to international to prevent cataclysmic climate change is through international agreements and programs that are going to require an awful lot more nation-state cooperation than we've seen up until the past. But I want to defend the United States on the refrigeration subject here. Well, if you live in Finland, you don't even need a refrigerator. You just put your beer out there in the snowdrift. And
Finland is actually one of the worst countries in this regard. We use energy and resources just crazy.
And I refuse to drink warm beer, which is just unpalatable the way that our British comrades would. So some things hopefully we will still have, and I hope one of them is cold beer, in a desirable future.
Yeah. Antti?
Yeah. The other thing is that when Robin mentioned cataclysmic climate change, how that will require us to, luckily that's already being worked to some extent, that we have international agreements on emissions. We need international agreements on resource use and so on. And I think, and will fail just as socialists of the early 20th century did. I'm trying to predict the future here, but I think that it is specifically this allocation of resources that will sort of be pushing to a change from a market economy to a democratically planned economy, because climate change in itself will require huge amounts of planning, both nationwide and globally. When you try to allocate emissions, you try to allocate resources for in a way that doesn't, over budget our planet. And I think that's where it'll simply become a necessity to create networks that actually provide, relevant data on resource use and emissions. And the best way to do that simply, I think, is some form of democratic system.
Sorry, Robin, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going but we should get to the particulars of, well, how do we propose that a country with a participatory economy should engage in international economic relations? And from an economist's point of view, there's three different types of international economic relations that any country can participate in, or decide not to participate in, or more realistically decide how much to participate and how to participate. And one is the best known is international trade. So a country is going to produce things that it exports to other countries, and in exchange, it's going to not produce certain things domestically. It's going to instead import those things from other countries. So one kind of international economic relation is trade. A second kind is what's called direct foreign investment, where an enterprise that is a foreign enterprise builds a plant. For instance, a Japanese automobile company builds an automobile assembly plant to build Toyota cars in Nashville, Tennessee, or the US company, a US-based company. So that's called direct foreign investment. And then there's a third kind of international economic relation, and that's international financial investment, where savers in one country are going to lend to borrowers in some other country. And so we have to think about, would a country with a participatory economy enter into any of these kinds of relationships? And if so, how would it go about doing? And direct foreign investment, I think we have a very clear answer to. Verboten. And here's the rationale, that one of the principles of a participatory economy is that workers should be able to self-manage themselves. And so if a foreign company invested in a country that had a participatory economy, it would be the foreign company and the owners of the foreign company that would decide how the work was done and what was being produced. And workers in a participatory economy would never put up with that. So we're not going to have direct foreign investment from capitalist companies based in other countries inside, a participatory economy. What about the reverse? Would production units in a participatory economy engage in direct foreign investment abroad? And we actually have an example, in the real world where something like that happened. The Mondragon collectives in the Basque region of Spain originally started out as a series of workers-owned cooperatives in Spain. And for a variety of reasons, mostly which were not their fault, they discovered that producing certain things in China was cheaper. And so they faced the choice of, are we going to set up subsidiaries, of Mondragon in China to produce certain things? And that means that Mondragon turned into being the employers of Chinese workers. And I think that's also something that in a participatory economy, workers' councils wouldn't be pushed by competitive forces to do that kind of thing. I don't want to blame Mondragon for that. But there's a lot of studies of Mondragon that said that this had a very debilitating effect on the entire sort of Mondragon project that all of a sudden they became capitalists of Chinese workers, which really violated their own fundamental principles. So that's the other. So we're not going to have direct foreign investment by foreign companies in the participatory economy, and workers' councils or federations of workers' councils in a participatory economy aren't going to engage in direct foreign investment abroad, which would effectively turn them into some other workers' employers. That doesn't mean that a participatory economy, that workers' federations, couldn't help workers, particularly established workers' co-ops in foreign countries. But we can't be their employers. That would be violating our principles. But I do think that while direct foreign investment is ruled out by the principle of self-management, worker self-management, that doesn't rule out trade, and it doesn't even rule out international financial investment. But it is true that a participatory economy, by its very principles, would have to operate somewhat differently in engaging in trade and engaging in international financial investment. And what the principles have to do with is, besides worker self-management, a fundamental principle of participatory economics is workers should be compensated and rewarded according to the efforts and sacrifices, that they make. And there are very different levels of economic development. And broadly speaking, amongst countries in the world today. And broadly speaking, what that comes down to is that on average, a worker in a less developed economy is compensated far less for their efforts and sacrifices than on average a worker is in a more developed economy. So there are huge differences in this regard. And one of the fundamental principles of a participatory economy is that those differences are unfair and unjust. Now, in terms of international trade, there is a way to deal with this. If there are benefits, and sometimes there are, if there are benefits from specialization and trade, rather than both countries produce everything that they're going to consume. And economists have a word for that. We call it autarky. Autarky is no trade between two countries. If there are, it's a sort of a well-established principle. David Ricardo was the famous one who taught the world that there are situations where there are differences in the opportunity costs of making things in different countries, and this creates the potential for mutually beneficial specialization in trade. So in those circumstances, we wouldn't want a participatory economy not to be able to take advantage of those circumstances. But the question is, how would it go about doing it? And it turns out that economists have a very simple concept. If there is mutual benefits from specialization in trade, those mutual benefits will be distributed between the two countries by whatever the terms of trade are. So the terms of trade are what distribute the benefit. And what we've proposed is, this is sort of, call it it's actually rule number 2. Rule number 1 is don't engage in international trade when there actually is no efficiency gain. And this is a more esoteric issue about, is there a lot of trade going on out there that actually isn't producing efficiency gains, and how does that happen, and how do you avoid that? But putting that aside for the moment, we're talking about trade that actually does generate an efficiency gain. Well, our proposal is that a participatory economy should participate in trade where there is an efficiency gain, and it should agree to terms of trade that distribute more than 50% of the efficiency gain to the country that is less developed, i.e. the country where workers on average are being less compensated, for their efforts and sacrifices. Now, it's important to point out, this isn't like foreign aid. That suppose a participatory economy was more developed than a trading partner, and it agrees to terms of trade where 60% of the efficiency gain, go to its trading partner, to the less developed country it's trading with. Well, that still means 40% of the efficiency gains are going to the participatory economy. So it's not like both countries don't still benefit, but it's basically our not to agree to terms of trade that obey what I call the more than 50% principle would basically be a violation of a participatory economy's commitment to one of its fundamental principles, and that is workers deserve to be compensated according to their efforts and sacrifices as best we can work out. And actually, I can finish up, and then we can talk about this some more. The same principle basically applies to international financial investment. There are times when international financial investment is not a good idea. It basically creates dangerous situations. I mean, we had the East Asian financial crisis. We had the financial crisis in the advanced economies in 2008 and 2009. Tremendous amounts of economic damage and inefficiency and harm are caused by these things. So the truth of the matter is, in the world today, we do not have a good operating system, that prevents international financial crises. So there's every reason for a participatory economy in that context to be very wary of getting itself involved overly with international financial investment activities. But in theory, sometimes differences in productivity and saving rates in different economies means that there's actually an efficiency gain from international lending. And our proposal is, well, in those cases, is there some reason in a participatory economy, a country with a participatory economy could not engage in those kinds of activities? And our answer is yes, but they'd have to also basically implement the greater than 50% rule. Because for trade, it's all the terms of trade. For international loans, it's what's the interest rate. So if there's an efficiency gain from international lending, the interest rate distributes the gain between the borrower and the lender. And so we have said our proposal is that a country with a participatory economy can go ahead and engage. If they can borrow internationally, they can lend internationally, but they would have to, in order not to violate their own fundamental principle of equity and fairness, economic justice, they would have to agree to interest rates on these international loans that distribute more of the efficiency gain, not to the lender or the borrower, because that could be either country, but the interest rate should distribute more than 50% of the efficiency gain to whichever country is less developed. And that would allow, small countries, more developed countries, less developed countries who begin to practice something along the lines of participatory economics. And it really doesn't have to be just, suppose they were I think these principles apply to a broad range of countries with somewhat different economies. Any country that has an economy that's committed to worker self-management in some way, and it's also committed to, the principle of economic justice as compensation for sacrifice and effort, by its own principles, essentially would be committed to putting these sort of rules into practice as it goes about participating in international trade and financial investment. So that's what we've proposed. That's what we've sort of thrown out there, saying, well, in the 21st century, in reality, if socialism comes one country at a time, we don't have a world socialist revolution, then countries are going to end up facing these dilemmas. And are there answers? And our answer is, there are answers, and they're not rocket science. It's sort of pretty straightforward. And it does mean that a country that adopted a participatory economy would not have to simply isolate itself and not be able to take advantage of the advantages that do exist sometimes from international trade and international financial investment.
It sounds to me like there's a principle actually used in human relations, particularly in relationships if you're dating and there's a discrepancy, called the campfire principle. It's basically the idea that you leave things better than when you found them. It's called the campfire principle because if you're out camping in the woods and you come upon some site, you want to try to not make things worse than what you found them. You want to try to make them at best, at least the way you found them, if not better than what you found them. And it sounds like the rules that you outlined there kind of reflect that it's trying to make things as fair as possible, all things told. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, I mean, I as a camper, I know and abide by the good camper principle that you just pointed out, and it is something like that. It's saying, look, we can do something together that potentially makes both of us better off.
Mm-hmm.
But in the case of a participatory economy, they then have to, for a country that has an economy that's an immoral or amoral economy,
mm-hmm.
the answer is always fight for the best terms of trade you can get. And the answer is always fight for the terms of interest on international financial investment that are the best you can get. If you're borrowing, you want the lowest interest rate. And if you're lending, you want the highest interest rate. And what we're saying is that its commitment to economic justice basically prevents a participatory economy from approaching international trade and international financial investment in the same way. It commits a country with a participatory economy to essentially abide by the good camper principle, which is, hey, we're all camping here together, and we have to be sure that we're all benefiting from that. But in particular, it means that more than 50% of any efficiency gain from international economic activity should go to whichever country is less developed in the first place. Now, this poses one very interesting problem. What if the less developed country has a capitalist economy? And what if it has a government that's a very undemocratic and repressive government? Well, does that mean that a country with a participatory economy that is more developed would have to grant that country beneficial terms of trade? And the problem would be, well, those beneficial terms of trade are propping up this terrible government and this, and continuing to prop up a very exploitative economy. So there are dilemmas that that countries are going to run into, and in particular, I mean, there was an actual real world situation like this when South Africa was governed, had an apartheid regime. Mm-hmm. What happened was, at a certain point in time, the internal political forces fighting to overthrow apartheid asked the international community to engage in an economic boycott. Mm-hmm. So sometimes, and in that case, in our case, that would be a situation where if there are internal political forces inside a less developed country with a horrific government and a terrible economy who are saying, you can help us now by not giving beneficial terms of trade or international loans that are beneficial because we are trying to overthrow, we have gotten to the point where we have a chance to overthrow this. Well, then you have to take that kind of thing into account. But in general, I can't morally come up with any reason for why the more than 50% rule should not be applied even in trade and international finance with countries that still have capitalist economies.
I'd like to tie in the kind of abstractions that we're talking about here regarding investment and trade, but also tying it into what Antti had mentioned some moments ago regarding, the environment and particularly the climate crisis that we're all facing. How are the two combined? How is it that these rules can help with regards to mitigating the climate crisis? I mean, if we were able to not only win a participatory economy in one country or maybe even in several countries, how is it that we know that those economies are going to be using these rules not only within their own interactions, but also in interactions regarding the global economy writ large for addressing the climate crisis, reducing the amount of carbon emissions? How does that play into this?
I mean, I now try every opportunity I ever have. I now try and make people aware of, I think, the most important website, on the planet, which is the www.ecoequity.com. there's an organization called EcoEquity, and they have been working, with delegations and environmental movements and organizations on the issue of climate change and international negotiations. And one of the things that has been part of those negotiations dating all the way back to 1992 is what's called the principle of differential responsibility and capability. And the issue essentially comes down to this. We know that countries all have to reduce their carbon emissions, and we know it has to happen really fast. But the question is, does that mean all countries have to reduce their carbon emissions by the same extent, to the same extent? Because countries objectively have contributed to the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere very differently. I mean, the US has put a hell of a lot more up per capita than, citizens of the Republic of the Congo. So there's huge discrepancies in international responsibility for having gotten us to this bad place that we are, contributing to the problem. And of course, there are huge differences in the capacities that different countries have, basically their levels of economic development, in order to sort of make some sacrifices that are necessary to reduce emissions. So what EcoEquity has done is basically come up with a way with quantifying the degree to which countries have differential responsibilities and capabilities, and therefore to what extent they should be required, in an international agreement to reduce their emissions. And we're talking about something that's very similar to that. I mean, what's happened is the countries with lesser responsibilities and capabilities have, at least in principle, successfully managed to enshrine that as part of what needs to be taken into account in whatever agreements are reached. And now we even have a way of quantifying it. So I do believe that if we solve the climate problem, that we will solve it in a way that already is signaling how do you solve problems like this in an equitable way, in a way that is equitable rather than just effective enough to stop climate change. And that principle that they're applying, and if we successfully apply a principle, something along those lines in international climate negotiations, I think is exactly the principle. It's the same as the 50% rule. I mean, the idea is that there is a logic, there's a justice logic to how either burdens are borne in the case of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or there's a principle about how are mutual benefits shared. They shouldn't necessarily be shared equally, 50% going to both parties. And I think there's no reason that a country with it. So one of the things that I'm that make me very optimistic is if we had discovered that the principles of a participatory economy somehow would prevent it from taking part in trade in a world that's a capitalist dominated rule. Most other countries are capitalist, large differences in economic development. If that basically meant that a country that adopted a participatory economy wasn't going to be able to participate in international trade or even international financial investment, well, that would have been a very sad realization. I mean, that would have been, well, that's a serious handicap that such a country would operate under. But in fact, I think what we've discovered is no, there's no reason that, but it would have to abide by some principles that are somewhat different than the principles that a country with an immoral economy operates under in the international world.
Antti?
Yeah, this reminds me about something that Norway did back in the 60s when they found oil from front of Norway. And what Norway basically did was that they, all the oil companies, all the international oil companies were just, oozing, they just wanted to get there and get all the oil. And Norway said that that's great, we have oil and you're free to, come here and, drill for it. But we will take 90% of all your earnings. So basically Norway mandated that any oil drilling that happens within Norway's area will have to, put almost all of the profits to the state of Norway. And that created the largest investment fund in world history, which is Norway's oil fund. And I think that is something that is basically the model for how participatory economies would work regarding especially, big capitalist countries or companies that, if they wanted to trade, these are the mandates, and participatory economy will, uphold its own principles within its area. Another thing that came to my mind while Robin was talking, that I could imagine that a participatory economy might want to create, an external company in some other country, or start working closely with a co-op in some other country. Mm-hmm. Basically, that the participatory economy would decide to support this project, especially, in a way that Robin described regarding the principles, how to operate with the surplus and profit that would generate, and would try to do it in countries, of course, not in countries that are, have slavery or something like that, but basically in many, capitalist countries, there's freedom for companies to, do their own workings as they see fit. And a participatory economy might choose to fund, to invest in such a project so that the workers living there could try to emulate as closely as possible the workings in an actual participatory economy. That's just an idea that came to my mind, that, a participatory economy might want to support these kind of projects.
No, there is an internet. There's an international cooperative movement that's been around since, the late 1800s. And it has a long tradition of co-ops in some countries, basically co-ops that are established on firm grounds, aiding people in starting up co-ops, that are on weaker grounds, and aiding them not only with advice about how you work, how does a co-op work? There's a learning process and a learning curve, but also with financial loans and beneficial arrangements, sometimes when they're trading products between them. So there's a long tradition of that, that I think is a very honorable and a useful tradition. There's another part of real history that's sort of relevant here. When in the early 1960s, when Cuba all of a sudden discovered that, oh my gosh, the United States is going to try and overthrow our revolution. We have to establish some sort of diplomatic and economic relations with somebody in the world. And so they started, and Che Guevara was the minister of industry. And so there was already the Soviet Union, there already were the Eastern European so-called socialist countries. They weren't really socialist, but they had their own sort of organization. Che Guevara went to the Soviet Union and the Eastern European countries, and he preached socialism to them. He said, look, we're much less developed than you, and we now can't trade with anybody. We can't trade with capitalist countries because the United States is, has us under a blockade. So we're going to be trading with you guys. And of course, you're socialists and we're socialists, so we expect that you are going to be willing to give us beneficial terms of trade. And in some sense, it was Che Guevara preaching back to them socialist ideology that they had long since forgotten. And to some extent, the Cubans, I do think, there was always a long debate amongst economists about whether or not the Soviet Union was propping up the Cuban economy, by giving it such beneficial terms of trade. And I don't think it was really that. I don't think, in fact, it was done to the extent, it certainly wasn't done to the extent that Che Guevara assumed it would be when he went to those meetings. But we are talking about something like that, that there is a principle that the citizens of any country with a socialist economy, when they're when they're engaged in trade relations or international financial relations with the citizens of any other country, in this case it was supposedly other brother socialist economies, that the terms of trade should be settled equitably, not just according to bargaining power. And there's no reason that can't be done.
Indeed. And what has been outlined here in this episode regarding financial investment, international trade, and foreign investment is one recipe to follow and has been outlined here. This has been PEP Talk, the podcast where we discuss the democratic alternative to capitalism known as a participatory economy. To find out more, you can visit the website participatory-economy.org. There you can join an online forum to discuss issues like the ones that we've been discussing here, as well as many other topics related to a participatory economy and other issues. And there's also an online newsletter sent out monthly from the website, which you can sign up and join to find out more there. On behalf of Antti in Helsinki and Robin in Portland, this is Mitchell in Chicago. Thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Self-management, democratic control of communities or workplaces, federal arrangements.
Participatory democratic planning.
Jobs to have a mix of empowered work, vested councils linked to one another. Everyone gets to participate in a primary council.
Please visit participatory-economy.org to find out more and subscribe to our newsletter. And don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks, and see you at the next episode.